I'm here with Sophia and Gabi. Hi,
Hi,
both
all.
of you. You're the best. Both of you are. And we're about to do something kind of difficult because we have a poem by Ann Lauterbach, and we all respect Ann Lauterbach's poetry. But when we encounter a new poem, and we haven't talked about this poem, we never prepare in advance. We don't know what we're going to say.
And no notes or anything.
No, well, you have notes. I don't. I have some lines, and Gabi, of course, has nothing. And it's a poem called Elision, and we really have no idea. I think we'll all sort of stipulate that it is a beautiful poem, but we don't know what we're going to say. So maybe this is I think Elision belongs roughly in the New York school, area. Maybe language, maybe New York school, but we don't know. We're going to look at this. So it's called Elision, and I'll read it. Elision. These habits within the chamber of doubt, you see, don't you, that wild grin on the face of the madman? You see the iced rupture, don't you, while listening to a glossy song for guitar, voice, and piano? You could swallow these chords. You could drown in this image. The hairy trees clustered stiffly, the bridge in the distance, the unequivocal train resonating, the gray bird landing on gray water. Okay, what are we going to do? Gabi, you start.
Well, before this all started, I said to you, I love this poem and I have no idea what it's about.
And is that okay?
Yeah,
Why is that okay?
Well, I'd say, one, it's common for me. But what's okay about that is, in this poem particularly, I feel like it's because we have this real assemblage of images. And some amount of meta-textual reflection on the fact that we are assembling images. What's also okay about it is that I sometimes find that understanding the poem is euphemistic for a particular kind of relationship with the poem. I could reword that poem in another way to somebody. I could teach that poem. I could, etc. But sometimes I think our first encounters with poems are around sound, around the way one image sits with another that if we find pleasurable or just interesting. And I'm the kind of person who likes it when something sort of makes my eyebrow raise and I kind of feel a little odd about it. Not everybody's like that, but I'm like that. So with a poem like this, I really like some of these, this listing of images. In those last few lines especially, you get it very literally. You'll have to remind me, what's that old poetic device for lists of images? Walt Whitman's kind of...
Catalog?
Yeah, catalog. You have the hairy trees clustered stiffly, the bridge in the distance, the unequivocal train resonating, the gray bird landing on gray water. Seemingly all in a shared scene, but very different images connected without a particular logic.
Sophia, did that help, what Gabi just said?
I think it did. It also helped that I just watched you circle the first line of the poem, which says...
So you're not going to take over now.
Yeah, these habits within the chamber of doubt. And suddenly I was like, oh, that's what it means. I'm allowed to read this poem and not really know what it's meant to be because my habit is to try to understand, but
you got it.
I'm allowed to not. I also wanted to say that I recently read some work by Ross Gay, the poet, and in a poem he writes, I love when a poet says, I'm trying, and that's in a poem, but I also really love that as an allowance of people reading poetry to just try. And that's kind of what I did when I met this poem for the first time earlier today. I really responded to it, but I had so many thoughts, but I didn't know what it was about. Yeah. And I think it's about trying.
I love that. And I think this is actually quite an Ashberyan poem. It's probably a little more adventurous than some Ashbery, because Ashbery really felt bad for us when he just sort of was putting notes down of things, phrases he's been collecting and so forth. And he tried to tie things up more often than Ann. But Ann, I think this is a very Ashberyan poem. I think of a poem like What is Poetry? And then he sort of lists, well, there's, this frieze on a thing from Nagoya maybe, or, he just sort of lists possibilities. So if we riff from these habits, the things the things that you're about to see me do and try within a chamber of doubt, that is a great definition of a certain kind of poetry. Then immediately gets meta. You, which would presumably be us trying to figure out, you see, I don't know what you're doing here. So you see, don't you? That wild grin. No, you see it, Anne, and now I see it, but, right, on the face of the madman, you see there's another seeing, don't you? While listening now, not seeing, a song, and it's a song for guitar, voice, and piano. Now I'm hearing it. You, if you keep working at this, you could swallow the chords of the sound, and you could drown in the image, and we're just getting a kind of synesthetic tour of a bunch of things that could be resulting from the habits, our habits, when we enter the chamber of poetic doubt. You know, and once you say what I just said or think what I just thought, you're free to just see what this poet is doing. Your turn.
Yeah, I think when we don't feel that we have that, let's say that logical sense, we don't know where we're landing in a poem, like we should go to a few things that help us, I don't know, characterize why this is different from, any other poem. And the first thing I think is that assemblage of images, but I also think we have this really weird moment that we just talked a little bit about, but that you see, don't you, like there's this, the poem hasn't quite started yet until about the fourth or fifth line, right?
Right.
We have this opening line that seems, as we're saying, kind of metatextual, and then we have this interrupted. And I was trying to think about that phrase, and a few things came to mind. Like, I think of somebody who's like trying to make sure that what they're seeing is real. Like, you see that, don't you? You see something. Or you see is also like euphemistic for like comprehension. Like, you see what I mean? Not literally seeing, but rather understanding. And then we have the image come after we've stuttered a little bit on that. The wild grin on the face of the madman. The
We got to say something about that wild grin.
I know, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's almost Bob Dylan-esque,
Yes,
circa
I think that's right.
1965.
I think that's right.
So it's a surrealistic thing. I think madness is a key here, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, it's interesting to me that we kind of stutter in that moment and then start to get to this list of images. And I think it's instructive, like, the different ambiguities of the phrase, like, you see, don't you? How many different ways that could be taken, that little stutter reveals all those different interpretations rather than just us, like, sitting with whatever comes to us first. If it just said, you see, don't you, that wild grin, right?
Sophia DuRose, is it possible that once we are liberated, the three of us have liberated ourselves from doing a close reading that would be sequential or would tie things up in any kind of bow, because we do that sometimes, we do.
We're pretty good at it.
I think we're pretty good at it, and I congratulate ourselves. But here we're just sort of assuming from the start that we are going to get to a different place of appreciation of a poem that we're not going to solve because it's not solvable and it wasn't meant to be solved. Mm-hmm. So I guess I want to ask you how that makes you feel as a pretty devoted close reader and kind of a dogged is the wrong word for you, but like an attentive, energetic, someone with a pen in hand trying to understand what you read. And are we liberated by what Anne is doing with the Ashberyan mode?
Well, I'd say that I'd say that any poem I meet on a page, I like to scrawl my little notes on, but that, like, whether the poem whether I can tie it into a neat bow or not, I still want to write on it. And this poem
what were you doing?
What
is all this? No. What was all this? What is this, an activity?
I was just reading. Yeah,
it's an activity, right?
It's interesting, and I mean, I think, like, what I started with when I first read the poem was I wrote down the definition of elision because I just wanted to keep that in mind as I read it. It's like an omission of an unstressed syllable. It's when you slur over an unstressed syllable.
Okay, and did you look for that?
Well, it helped me understand. I think it helped me understand the poem a little bit better because I asked myself, like, what does the landscape in this poem ignore? What do we slur over when we're trying to make a point about what we're saying? What are we missing in this poem? And that makes me want to write on it. And I think that's important.
No moss growing on this Rolling Stone. That's right. I think that's a really great observation.
Yeah, so I don't know.
But my question is, are you liberated from all your ridiculous notes?
I just don't think notes are constraints. I feel no less liberated.
I didn't mean to mock your notes.
It's okay.
In fact.
But is that tactile, right? Like I think, we like to think that reading is linear. Like I start at the beginning, I end at the end or whatever, but we know, and I would say that somebody like Roland Barthes said this much more eloquently, but there's a pleasure in the kind of moving around that we actually do. Like I have a theory that nobody really can read a book front to back in a very literal sense, that actually we're always kind of moving in some sense around the page, that our eyes are not so good at that. But this kind of like note-taking, which I've kept the page quite...
You're the opposite, right?
I'm like, well, because I never know what you're going to do, so I always think, well, do I even write anything down? I'll just improv without...
So maybe I've distorted this liberation.
I just think it's a kind of tactile, like living with the poem, that it's part of the reading process. Like the reading process is as tactile as the notes are. So I think that makes sense. But about that title, like Elision, I mean, it's quite a way to start, right? It's like you're saying your poem is kind of in that empty space. It could be quite literally the grammatical elision of something like don't, which is eliding the not or do not. But that phrase, you see, do not you see, doesn't actually work without the elision, right? You have to say don't you rather than do not you. But it's also something about the elision of perhaps the central meaning of the poem, about images that are not being written through. I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to do something that goes against what we've been saying a little bit. I'm just going to put into the record a different reading. Not an entirely different reading. It's not going to contradict. Believe me, it's just going to add. Okay. I want to think that the poem ends with a very particular landscape. And that the chords of the piece, the song, guitar, voice, and piano, lead us to an image. And I want to think that after you could drown in the following image, colon. She doesn't use a colon. And here it is, okay? And bear with me. The hairy trees clustered stiffly. Got it, right? That's the nature image. The bridge in the distance. Oh, wow. I see it, right? And there's got to be some water there because the birds are landing on it, but also because of the drowning, right? So I've got a bridge, and bridges tend to cross water, not always, but this is the scene. You've got trees along a river, a bridge far away, and a train. And so often by rivers and crossing rivers, it may even be a train bridge. I've got a scene. And I've got a scene, and when a train that is not equivocal, that is not elided, it is a fucking train. It is a train that is going to go over this bridge, whether you like it or not, and that disturbs the bird that then must fly up and land on gray water. It is it's almost as if to say, I'm going to write a poem that is a trying until I get to an image that I am capable of as a poet. And I'm going to include the etude, the working up, the note scratching, and the thoughts, the meta thoughts, until I finally get to, and we're being addressed in a quite beautiful and moving way. The poet is saying, you could drown in this image. This could consume you. This could be the poem of your life. And I just want to finish this little sermonette by referring to, I've never delivered a sermonette. It's always a sermon or a question. Right? Wallace Stevens' Sunday Morning. Stevens was very important to Ashbery, and I'm just going to assume that Ann Lauterbach got the Stevensian thing. Yeah, right? Sunday Morning, his most famous poem. I don't think it's actually characteristic, and I don't think it's his best poem, but it's an early one. And it is a poem that was written in like 1915, and he's wrestling with this problem. Once God is dead, once religion doesn't work for us as a solace, as a fiction that will suffice for us to get through life, there's only poetry. Poetry is the new supreme fiction. That's the basis of modernism, I think. American modernism, anyway. And at the end of Sunday Morning is a woman on a Sunday morning deciding not to go to church. Sorry, I'm teaching you this poem. You probably know it already. But she's there, and she thinks about the green freedom of a cockatoo and coffee and oranges on a Sunday morning. It's a really evocative, aesthetic, like I am going to choose to live, and I'm complacencies of the peignoir. So she's wearing a nightgown, and she's peeling oranges. It's a very, very evocative scene, and she's not doing God. She's not doing church. And this is the church of poetry. The poem ends with a fluttering of birds. And the birds, I think they're doves or something, and the birds are scattered and they begin to go down and they find a groundedness. This is the Barth stuff, like there is no ground. SZ, goodness gracious, what's going to happen? But there is a tentative ground, the water, right? This is like, so the poem ends downward into darkness on extended wings, and the birds finally settle on something that is not ground, but it is an elided ground. It's a ground of instability. It's a ground of where the moderns are going to have to stand on this water, not walk across the water, as it were, but drown if they have to. And so I think I liked what I just did there, but I think this is an homage to this kind of groundedness that needs a working up to get there. It's an image.
Yeah.
This is what happens to an image.
I see what you're saying. I mean, I think that makes sense. I think, like, though, another way of also reading this is that it's kind of exposing what doesn't work in that image, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that drowning can be taken quite negatively, and so that to get to that image, to ramp up to the sort of like Bob Ross version of the thing, here's the nice little trees and the bridge and
Bob Ross.
To get to that.
Oh my God.
No, to get to that.
Ruined it.
No, I like Bob Ross. To get to the image.
That's the kitsch, the kitsch Gabi.
Yes, that's true. To get to there, you have to elide a lot. You have to you have to pretend that there's a certain amount of things not going on. And this poem is about actually not being Elision.
As Ashbery said, you can't say it that way anymore.
Right, yes.
You cannot just give an image of a bridge and some trees. You got to make the trees hairy, right? You've got to have a train that's not going to fuck around. And the drowning in this image means hypersuffusion, right? The aura, the whole, you've got to go all the way in if you want to get an image now in 1995 or 2008, whenever this poem was written. Sophia?
Well, a part of my notes was reading something that Anne said, which was the reader has to trust that there's a reason for the things to follow other things, reason beyond the necessities of syntax. Mm-hmm. So when you were giving your sermonette, I was thinking about like this building and like the I have to trust that there's a reason we're being told, like, don't you see, like, I'm getting to it, and building into this image of the gray bird landing on gray water. And I was thinking a lot about gray in this poem too. I don't know if I know why, but I like to think I have ideas why.
Well, I think it's a dimness. It's a fogginess. It's not a clarity.
I was just reading Primo Levi's Zinc, and zinc being a
In
gray
the
metal.
periodic table.
Yeah, and it's not toxic, and it doesn't produce like these striking chromatic reactions, as he put it. Right. And I was thinking of gray in the sense of like, it's not striking, it's not dramatic, but you can still see it and you can still care about it, even though it's not like the brilliant flame of other things. Mm.
Wow, I think we're doing well with this. Let's do final thoughts, okay? Gabi, you got one?
Yeah, I'll just say to what I was saying earlier about like what you have to elide to get to the image. Like, one of the lines we haven't really talked too much about is, you see the iced rupture, don't you, while listening to a glossy song, right? Like, I think the glossy song is what I referred to as like the Bob Ross version. Like, when we get to guitar, voice, and piano and they all make a nice song together and it's glossy and it's been recorded and beautiful. She's saying, you see the rupture, right? You see like what kind of doesn't work. Iced is a modifier I can't quite figure out yet, but give me a little while and we'll see. But you see that rupture, don't you? Right? I think this is a poem about, it's almost like anti-imagist in a way, in that it's interested in revealing what it takes to create an image by elision or something. So
great. Thank you. Sophia?
I like how there's a simultaneity of summoning and then disrupting intimacy in the poem, because it starts with calling me in. You see, don't you see? Like, it's this dramatic, like, dragging, this desperation in that repetition of, you see, don't you, like, come with me. But she hasn't given me anything to look at yet.
Yeah.
And then it's this image that I can kind of picture in my head because she's described it, or the poet has described it, but I'm not there. Like, this is an image that I might not, like, tangibly have.
Yes.
So I just like the different valences of being there and not.
My final thought is kind of meta-pedagogical, which is that if the three of us were to sit down with a poem that maybe we didn't know, hadn't prepared, hadn't talked about, but it was a pretty straightforward poem with an image that, I wouldn't feel as excited as I do now about what we've just accomplished improvisationally. I want my poems to be hard, not because I care that much about poets who make things deliberately hard, which may be the case here, I don't know. I care more about what it makes possible for us, that you could come all the way from Chicago and say, okay, what do we do? Let's check that box, or not that you would ever do that, but one can imagine a Modpo person traveling far and then kind of phoning it in.
Sure.
And we didn't phone this in because it challenges us to make something of it. And that's part of the trying, of course, that you were talking about. It's exhilarating, it's necessary. It also forces us to imagine a world that may or may not exist. And that's what poetry should do. And other genres don't quite do it as well as poetry, yay poetry. But I'm saying yay us. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.